Thank you guys. Welcome. Good morning. I'm going to pass it briefly to Martin, and then we'll say some words. But as a reminder, two things. Operationally, there will be someone coming around taking your order, so take a look. There's a menu on your seat, or not on your seat, on your placemat. And then also, this is meant to be dialogue, and you guys all are invested in this conversation, so please jump in, ask questions. That's important. But I'll pass it to Martin now.
Thank you, Ava. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's really, I know it's hard to come to such terrible surroundings. I don't know how folks, you all live here, I assume. It must be really difficult. But no, really appreciate everybody coming. I am the CEO of a nonprofit called Just Capital. Ronaldo is on my board and also one of the founders of Just Capital. And we had an event about a year ago when in Santa Barbara, where we met. Ava, you and I met there. Peter, I think we met there. And apologies if anybody else was at the breakfast too. And we had just a really nice chat. And the purpose of that was really to try and raise awareness of what Just is doing, but really have a dialogue around what's going on in the world of business today and how we, as people who care very deeply about business and who see business as something that can be a real force for good in the world, how do we build that movement? What does that look like? And Just has a role to play in that. Just very quickly, we were founded almost 10 years ago.
Yes.
I was hired 9 years ago. The first Just board meeting was just over 10 years ago, and it was the brainchild of Deepak Chopra, who was teaching a business class at Columbia Business School around the idea of what does just business mean? How can business be more just in the world? And if you know Deepak, you know his instincts are very powerful around these things. So he found his way through Ronaldo and one or two other founding board members to Paul Tudor Jones, who is a Wall Street legend, trader, macro trader, philanthropist, founder of Robin Hood Foundation. And Paul sort of immediately seized on the idea as something that could become a bigger movement. And in particular to focus on the largest corporations in America. His insight at the time, 10 years ago, was we shouldn't define what just business means. We should talk to the American public. So that's what we've done. We've done a huge amount of research on how Main Street America thinks about business, what issues people care about. We have become, I think, the preeminent organization that is tracking, ranking, and now working with the biggest corporations in the country on how to be more just. We can talk about how we do that. And we've created a platform at Just Capital that has very strong media dimension because the narrative around business is very important. I'm actually here for the CNBC CEO Summit, which is taking place here over the next few days. I don't know if any of you are attending that. We have a partnership with CNBC where all our data, all our stuff, my face goes on every now and again for interviews, my colleagues, to really advance this idea of why being a just company is good for business and good for investors. We work very closely with the investment community. So we have 13 or 14 different funds, indexes, different kinds of fund strategies, which gives us, I think, a very interesting lens on what is the investor case, the shareholder case for being just, which is crucial. And I think the thing that I'm personally most gratified about is the fact we are now working with hundreds of large corporations with the leadership of those businesses in different areas where they themselves want to drive change because they feel it's in their best interest. And those are that program work that we do and the tools that we've developed, I think are really driving impact at scale, which is the whole idea of Just Capital in the first place. But I think what we want to talk about today is more the overall issue of business leadership in America right now in May 2023. What does that mean? What does that look like? Businesses being assailed from the left and the right. There is not one company that I work with that I know of. There is not one board member of a company that is not grappling in some way, shape, or form with stakeholder leadership, trust. How do we tell our story? Do we stick our necks out and say anything? That's happening in every company right now. So this breakfast, this conversation, I think is very, very well timed, because I think as leaders in the business community, there are things we can do to try and not just make our own lives, our own business leadership journey more effective, but plug into something bigger. And I think that's what we're really trying to do here.
Yeah. I mean, I think something top of mind for us, at least in the finance industry, is the economy is slowing down. I mean, I know that lending is kind of tightening back across the board. Do you notice or sense from the boards and the companies that you're talking to that focusing on ESG principles is somehow now going to be less of a priority? Or does it change the dynamic in the sense that the economy is shifting?
Yeah, I think every company's on its own journey, quite honestly, and I don't see a pullback on investing in stakeholders. I see companies really struggling to figure out what the framework looks like to decide that. How do we, ESG is just sort of one part of this. So
could you explain the difference between ESG and just?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Or
Or
what's
your
Okay.
definition of just?
Let me zoom back a little bit. Maybe.
Yeah, let me start.
Let me bring Ronaldo in, because you were right there at the beginning.
Yeah.
So
the idea was, when Deepak first broached it to me, was how do you get businesses to focus basically on constructive behaviors that probably are in their best interest? Because Deepak and I have been involved with each other for many, many years. He's been a fellow of the Academy, and he's a close friend. And I was running the Chopra Foundation at that point for him as a courtesy. And I said, well, Deepak, you're not going to tell Wall Street to meditate its way to a new future. That would be the ultimate ESG overlay. What you're going to have to do is show them how they make more money and prosper with a different model. So let's talk about how would that look? And he said, oh, well, then that would be like a just company. And I said, yeah, that would be a sort of a just company. So what makes for a just company is it made the commitment 10 years ago, as you just heard, and I was really pleased to say that I led the search committee that found Martin, who has a PhD in environmental sciences way before it was cool, and has an interesting background in industry, as senior VP of Swiss Re. He's done that, and now, as I love to say, the star of stage and screen, because there's a new documentary coming out, Why Mona Lisa is Smiling, and he and Eileen Fisher and some other people are in it, and it's about the shift that's occurring in the business world. So where does Just start and where does ESG stop, or the overlay? Just has spent 150,000 interviews now. How many?
north of that.
North of 150,000 interviews for the last 9 years, asking people all over the country, what do you believe constitutes just corporate behavior? What do you want to see from a company? Not what do we want to tell you to look for, which could be an ESG precondition, so to speak. You could go into that conversation saying, well, don't you believe in environmental, social, and governance? Well, many people do, but not necessarily in that order. And so our goal at Just Capital was, let's keep finding out every year, so we take more surveys, and then we will rank the 1,000 largest public companies in America by how they do against that public feedback. Mm-hmm. So we're extraordinarily data intense at Just Capital. In other words, the research budget this year will be way north of $10-11 million, just looking at the 1,000 companies. And we work with companies. One of the things that's really special about Just, and why I'm glad we're having the conversation today, is when you plug into the Just network, what you're really plugging into is best practices. So what we do is we try to find out which companies have the best practices in which segments, and then how do you rank them? And we put together a fund with Goldman Sachs how many years ago? 6 years ago now? Mm-hmm. 6 years ago we put together and we said, if we're right, if our theory is right, that the way we are identifying companies that are acting more in concert with how the public sees just behavior, those companies theoretically should outperform the Russell Index on a per share basis, both in earnings and market cap. So took us a while. We got Goldman Sachs to agree to carry the ETF. Every year it's been out, all 6 years, we dramatically outperform the Russell. My guess this year we're probably up 11, 12% of the Russell. So that is because we are asking the companies, what is it that you do? And it appears that stakeholder capitalism is the distinction between just and ESG. So stakeholder capitalism, which we've been teaching for over a decade, is when you look at all your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, your vendors, the environment, your shareholders, if you take care of all of them, you tend to have a better performance to your bottom line. That was the theory. So there's no ESG overlay in that. It's merely about, but there is an evolving public awareness. I was shocked the first year we did the survey that the average worker wasn't outraged at executive salaries in the abstract, just upset if they weren't getting paid fairly at Walmart for the starting salaries. So what we try to find in Just Capital is where is the public today in what its expectations are, and are the leaders of the companies responding to that in a way that makes them in tune with the times and therefore more profitable. And so that's turned out to be true. So is that
what was your question?
What I just heard is that you don't think that there's an absolute definition of just. There's an evolving definition of just.
That's right.
And so as societal norms change and people's values shift, so will your definition of just.
The public will tell us.
Yeah. So the framework that we've gotten now from 10 years of polling doesn't shift.
Okay.
So a company's investment in its workforce, its customers, communities where it operates, supply chains, the environment, and its shareholders through good governance. That framework has been consistent throughout, and I don't expect that to change.
Okay.
What evolves is underneath each one of those, what issues become more or less important. We don't poll on companies because now you're getting all sort of brand perception, and now we're on the issues. And every year, fair pay and paying a living wage has been at or close to the top of the list of all the issues, regardless of whether you're a Republican or Democrat or where you live in the country or your economic bracket. So some things have been immutable. Other things like, CEO pay to average worker, or like jobs. We've seen jobs, the importance of a just job rise and fall. Now it's very, very high on the list. In COVID, it was all about, are you investing in your workers' health and safety, as you would expect.
Which, by the way, is going to get interesting this year because I'm waiting to see what happens with the pushback on Roe v. Wade. A lot of people are wanting companies to take care of their employees medically. And companies are stepping up. JP Morgan.
And making statements about it.
And then there's the whole pushback that, Iger's taken on Florida, DeSantis. And that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Business was sort of like trying to stay out of the fray. And I think we still have to, we can't be politicized. We can't be painted in a progressive or a conservative ideology. We have to stay true to factually what is it people say they want and which companies are servicing that the best in the belief that that will produce the best bottom line, which it does. And that's what the ETF. So that's why I'm so proud of what we did with Goldman, because our ETF outperforms the Russell every single year. So it demonstrates that the companies ranking highest, which we call the Just 100, those tend to really outdo the standard run-of-the-mill Russell company.
Are you aligned with B Corps at all? Because it sounds
like
a similar framework.
No, so I've been around this for years. B Corp is a different concept. And so this is not necessarily in the largest public companies in America. Very few, if any, are B Corp.
Your question was on B Corp?
Yeah.
The strategy of thinking about all the stakeholders involved aligns with the B Corp framework. So I was just wondering if there is.
Yeah. So let me sort of map this for you. So we didn't set out to ask people about stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah.
We just asked them, what do you think about companies? What issues do you care about? What do you think about this idea of a just company? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And we didn't know what the answer would be.
Yeah.
We had faith or hope, maybe, that it would be a common sense framework that would actually, if companies did that, would work out. The stakeholder model that I just mapped out absolutely does align pretty well with B Corp. The key difference is we're focused on the biggest corporations. Right. They're like the ocean-going liners of the economy. They take ages to turn. They carry thousands of small companies in their wake. They affect, communities all around the world. So we figure if we can get them to shift a little bit, that makes that is going to help address our most pressing societal challenges. And you can't actually do it unless and until that happens.
Yeah.
And how do you communicate with consumers so that they know who the more just companies are?
That is the defining question of just capital.
But historically, we had this great relationship with Forbes. So every year there would be one issue where they would print the Just 100.
Right.
And then they would carry it on their electronic platforms and stuff. And then, 2 years ago, we did the CNBC
2 years
deal?
ago. So it's a strategic question because not everybody reads Forbes, right?
Yeah, right.
On Main Street America.
No.
So here's what we did. We basically leveraged the companies themselves. So our strategy, unlike B Corp, which is we're going to give you the roadmap. We're going to hold your hand and walk you up to the top of the mountain, right? And it's a real investment that companies make. And a lot of small companies are doing it, and it's great. But it requires a real commitment to a governance shift and everything else. Our goal was to sort of, okay, how can we create a race to the top? How can we incentivize companies to want to do this?
Right.
And so the investor lever is really important, obviously. The consumer lever, i.e. there are people out there who want you to do this,
Yes.
is the toughest one, if I'm being really honest with you. The worker lever is actually more powerful because many, many workers today, especially younger people entering the workforce, you go to any business school around the country, they want to work for companies that align with their values. And even if it means getting paid a bit less, they want flexibility, they want good benefits, they want all sorts of things. So the worker lever was one that we focused on. Okay. But what we've done to try and create the movement is focus on lifting up leadership and celebrating the most just companies. So that's what we do on CNBC. It's what we do with the companies. So the companies themselves get to say, we're a just company. We have a great seal that they promote to everywhere. So we're trying to get the companies themselves to go to their customers, their consumers, and say, hey, this independent nonprofit has said we're the best at, women in the workplace. Right. Which we do. So Accenture would be a leader in that space. Accenture would say to all its clients, public, all its, so that's the strategy on that.
Are you interested in, there are these technologies that I know there's a small company in Santa Barbara that I know is wants to do this product by product. So they want to eventually a QR code that would include a bunch of data inputs that would tell you how just the company was. They're particularly interested in how environmentally focused. So you could scan a QR code on this backpack and this backpack, and it would tell you the score for this one is 100, and the one over here is a 32, and you'd buy the one that was 100. So
Sure.
Is that?
Sure. I think I see this as part of a big ecosystem of change where there's going to be many, many innovations at all different levels. That particular approach has been tried many times in the past, and at the point of sale or when you're shopping, people are just less likely to do it. Okay. But maybe more people are now because or certain product types, or certain customer verticals where people will be more willing to do that. But I see just as just being part of an ecosystem, you know, and I think we can try and spark a wider movement. Again, zooming out, I don't see a vision for American capitalism, values-led capitalism, being advanced right now in any political or governmental sense. I don't see that vision. Maybe it's out there and you see it, but if you would ask me right now, like, who is the leader of the just capitalism movement? Like, which CEO embodies that? I mean, our number one company is Bank of America right now. Sorry, Eva. Brian Moynihan, maybe, but I don't know who is the champion of that.
I think one of the things that's why we did the breakfast, and I'm going to, Eva and me, one of us will sponsor this get-together again in about a quarter or something, and I'm hoping some of you will take our free newsletter in the meantime, because we believe that the information that we're developing is very, very useful. It's predictive behaviors. And what's happening, I personally believe, is that the business community is being required by the breakdown in political systems to assume more responsibility for the ecosphere within which we operate. It's whether we weren't asking for it, but that's what got dropped
exactly
on
right.
us. And so we need to stay on top of how that's moving. And Just's goal is to show that it is moving in a way that's appropriate to where society wants businesses to be, which obviously creates savings in your marketing costs. If companies don't hate you, it turns out it's cheaper to market to the customer.
Our polling supports that. You know, all around the country, people want more from business.
And how often are you polling, actually?
We poll continually, right? So we have a sort of it's not one poll. It's a series of public opinion research. We do focus groups in rooms not quite like this, but a bit like this around the country. We poll. What's that?
Oh, with donuts.
With donuts. Yeah, that's right. We poll on issues when there are major issues, you know, that arise, you know, during the course of the year. We do quantitative polling, meaning how do you weight issues? You know, if you ask people what they care about, they'll say they care about everything all the time. And so, but you actually make trade-offs a lot. So where does climate change fit relevant to, or relative to, I don't know, just jobs or something like that. So we're constantly trying to take the pulse of Main Street on critical business issues and then bring that to the companies to say, hey, this is what your stakeholders really care about.
So does your information, in my experience, the hard part of stakeholder capitalism is when the interests of the stakeholders come into conflict, right? So Peabody Coal wants to close this coal mine, and that's probably right for the shareholders, it's probably right for the environment, and it's an absolute tragedy for the community. Does your information help companies in any way make decisions when the interests of the stakeholders are completely opposed?
It certainly, yes, it helps them understand the relative dynamics of that. We're not meaning...
Could you,
it's
not
you
score it? Could
it's
you
not
say,
going to...
You know, it's a -9 for community, +4 for environment, +3
That's
for
exactly
shareholders.
Yeah.
Therefore,
that's exactly
therefore
what
it's a winner.
That's how we.
Perspective?
No, it's a cumulative score. So each company is scored in its own vertical, and then there's a cumulative score for the companies that do the best in all the verticals. But to your point, I've never found it that the stakeholders are ever in complete opposition to each other. What they usually are is in search of a new formula. So take your Peabody Coal example. Right now, the best companies are finding ways to re-employ people in new emerging industries. Kentucky's a great example of it. There's a lot of money being poured in because of IRA and renewable energy into Kentucky. So there's your Peabody Coal example. Peabody, if they want to be smart, has to do two things. One, what's the industry of the future for Peabody Coal? That's a good question. And and if you think it's never going to change, it's always going to be Peabody Coal, I would suspect that that's a limited view of how much environmental damage is happening and will continue to accelerate. So we need to help companies. Like one of my companies I advise a lot is Total out of France. And I'm helping them basically transition to the hydrogen future. So they got it. and Chevron started to get it too, by the way, that there's a new fossil fuel alternative that's emerging that's very powerful, that's going to be in response to climate change, clearly, but it's also going to be more profitable. And that was a novel thing for Total to see. So part of what we do is, I think at Just Capital, is we keep trying to balance who's doing well on each of these verticals. And I think we don't take credit for it. But can I just mention the Walmart example across the country? So in Walmart, when they were having all this crap about what they weren't paying their people, one of the things we did is we put all of the Walmart employees in America on a map. And we said, what is the cost of living in that county? And how much is that worker at Walmart being subsidized? How much is Walmart being subsidized? Because that worker is actually on assistance programs. So they're not picking up their fair cost of their business. That was an enormously impactful study, and is what, we don't take credit for things that's smart not to, but that's clearly what led Walmart to make the decision they made, which was to, okay, we got a problem. And if you notice, they've jumped wages now 3 times in a row. They're trying to get caught up because they now realize they were playing a short game of save money today, but they were building up a residual ill will that was not worth the money they were saving. Yeah. In the employee base. And then we talk to other people.
We found that a lot of the public tends to have a pretty common sense view. So people understand we live in a capitalist society. There's going to be layoffs. Factories are going to get shut down. So oftentimes we find it's how those things are done that matters. The idea of a layoff, well, you can do that in a just way. You can provide people with, educational, support, training. You can help them. Walmart has done that. Portable skills that can be, elsewhere. Actually, Walmart's probably one of the strongest employers now, even when they close down or when people move on. So there were ways to do things, which I think, to your point, is like a reframing of this tension. Wage increases is a great example. We've seen, I don't know, the last count was like 180 wage increases across the Russell 1000 in the last 2 or 3 years, mostly at the bottom end of the pay scale. And sometimes companies, get killed in the market for a short period of time, but then you tend to see the company do better over the longer term. And our work with PayPal is another good example of that. Dan Schulman did a survey of his employees expecting a great story. Turned out many of them were suffering financially, even though they were quite well paid. They weren't minimum wage. And so they developed a whole program, which was sort of, had he not been such a strong leader, I think would not have been easy to get through. But it was like this idea of how do we create a holistic sense of financial wellness for our employees. And so that's not just around increasing pay, it's lowering the cost of benefits, it's stock ownership and financial education, things like that. And they've just seen such a tremendous return on that investment, but it takes, a long time. So it's sort of a lot of times your dynamic, the tension that you feel is over what period of time.
Take the KKR formula. Basically, what explain the KKR. That's really a great one. In terms of
ownership works is their effort to really invest in businesses that are providing stock ownership.
This is KKR.
Yeah. And they've been actually at this quietly. Stavros has been at this now for quite a few, maybe 6, 7 years, 8 years now. But what they've been able to do is document how much better they did coming out of deals by cutting all the employees in for a piece of the deal. And it's a great little video on it. In fact, I think 60 Minutes did a thing on it. We like to work with them because we think that model actually works for employees, but it clearly is working for KKR.
But it takes time. It takes time.
In terms of rebranding from barbarians to
barbarians.
And there's no gate.
How do you guys think about issues that can come up in the supply chains of these major brands? Like Nike recently having labor issues come up. They're not the owners of these factories, but it still impacts them and their customers. Does that come up in your rating system?
Yeah, it does. It's sort of sort of interesting. It's very complicated. One of the things people want is more transparency and more data on what's happening in supply chains. So if you go looking for, companies that embrace that will now start to examine their supply chains much more carefully. And so you're going to find things that are not good. But knowing about a problem doesn't create the problem. But to the outside world, we know about those issues now because they've been, the spotlight has been shown on them. So it requires companies to act on that. So, it
decrease their score, I guess.
It depends how they're responding.
And have you talked about having an unjust 100?
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't do that though.
But
well,
do you want transparency? I'm really interested. Do you want consumers and workers and all the other players to know who the least just are, and what do you do with that? How do you handle that?
The long short idea.
Yeah. So the long short, actually, the long short trade is the best way to trade our data. That's been that VIG between the top 10 or 20% and the bottom 10 or 20%. In any industry, has just been the most powerful investment signal that we've created, I think, over the last 10 years. But it's a question of strategy. So we do publish the entire rankings except the bottom 10%. What you'll see is if Dollar General is in the bottom 10%.
Okay.
If you go to justcapital.com, you'll see all the data, all the polling, everything I've talked about is all the rankings. You can click on a company, you can see everything. But we don't name and shame the bottom because we knew that journalists would be like, who's the worst company?
Right, absolutely.
And it's a big story, but we chose not to do that.
Okay.
And you can tell me, I'd love your opinion on this. Do you think this is the right choice or a wrong choice? We didn't do that because we wanted to work with the companies that were leaders. We wanted to lift up leadership, not name and shame.
Actually,
and as a CEO, my management strategy, and was just talking about this last week, is that shame is a horrible management tool, an absolutely horrible one. But I think transparency is a great management tool. So I think there's probably a trade-off between actively publicizing who's in the bottom 10% and giving the consumers and workers the information to know where do those people fall? They're just missing.
I hear you. So we've had this.
Right?
No, but I got to say, when Deepak and I and Paul started this thing, my mother influenced this decision. Because my mother said to me, you catch more flies with a spoonful of honey than a barrel full of vinegar.
You do.
And so I've always thought, let's stay away from the vineger. And so we try to do best practices and you conclude what you want about the ones that don't engage in.
So my point, what I'm wondering is there a way to provide transparency without engaging in shame? Because I agree. I think shame is terrible. I just watched a manager try and use shame as a tool last week and thought, are you kidding me? No one responds well to shame. Mm-hmm. They all get defensive. They all dig in their heels. It's awful. But on the other hand, I want to know who's in that bottom 10%.
Well, you would know who's in the bottom 10% if you went to our site. Yeah. You'd see the names. You wouldn't just see. What we didn't want was them in rank order.
Right.
Because we didn't want a journalist to say,
who's it worst?
That company is the worst. Like Tesla. Tesla was in the bottom 20% for a long time.
Yes, well, I don't own a Tesla.
And the reason they were in...
Because I'm pretty sure they're in that bottom 10%, so...
A question on this, just for the enormous transition that we've had in the last 3 years. With more and more people being... We always say there's a lot of people, if you're working in the knowledge economy, obviously remote work has become this huge thing. Do you think remote work or what changes have you seen through your studies influencing whether this is more important with remote work or less important, or is there any data that's
the public opinion research has suggested that, and it's evolved, that certainly in the knowledge economy is around flexibility. People want to have, when we polled on how many days a week you want to be in the office, it was 3. Right? The bell curve was 3. And when you double click on what people are really looking for, it's around flexibility of location. A lot of people in the knowledge economy, if you have a job in New York City, it's very difficult to afford, even on a 6-figure salary, to live in New York City. So, but people would be happy to live and work, in surrounding areas and commute in. So, it was a lot of it was around the overall sort of condition of the work.
This is interesting because one of my companies is an organic food and cosmetic company, and we offer to basically the assembly line worker to put the products together what they preferred in how many days a week, knowing that they would be reduced in pay if they went for 4 days versus 5, or if they chose, would they like to have 4 days that were 10 versus, all of the workers virtually chose 4 days. And they said, it's much better for us with childcare, it's better for us. And so we said, great, we're going to become a 4-day-a-week company. And so the reason I pointed this because it's not just knowledge workers. People are looking for more flexibility in how their employer will address their concerns. And it clearly pays in terms of less turnover. Institutional memory doesn't go away. I mean, it's just a better way to run a railroad.
Are they running 410?
Yeah.
410. So same hours, just
same hours.
410.
They wanted 410.
I think Tesla does that. They work a 312 and then a 410 and then a 312 and 410.
You used to do 410 straight.
But
that was what they voted in.
Have you been able to determine which
Elon
of the
does the
stakeholders
48
has the biggest
one or
impact
whatever
on
it is.
company performance?
Say again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which of the stakeholder groups, whether it's the employees or the shareholders, focusing on any of these has the biggest impact on the performance of the company?
On market performance?
Market performance and financial performance and maybe overall performance.
So our data would suggest it's the worker category. How the relationship between a company and its workforce. Yeah, it's now about 40% of our overall model. Those criteria, because that's what the public have told us, and that's how they've weighted those issues. And so, maybe to Duncan's point, I think not only is it most heavily correlated with financial outperformance, but I think it's probably the single biggest driver of a company's forward competitive advantage overall. And it's probably the biggest topic of conversation around the relationship between employer and employee.
So building the human-centric organization. The
human capital, the world of human capital, I think is the thing that has changed the most in the last few years since COVID. I think some of that was forced upon us just by events on the ground. But I think people have actually begun to rethink how we think about human beings at work.
Yeah. So do you guys, when you get the scores of these companies, you've collected a ton of data internally. Are you taking that data and turning it into advice or guides for these companies to be able to get to better scores?
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Exactly. And that's kind of what I alluded to at the start. We've created program areas where we gather companies together, if they want to say, okay, what does the roadmap look like for you to be better on this issue or that issue? One of the biggest areas is around pay and worker financial wellness. We actually took that PayPal program and created a game plan that any company who wanted to invest in the financial health of their workforce could participate in that. And that's now, 15, 16 companies, it's millions of workers, and we're starting to see companies really change. We did, after George Floyd, we worked with 2 or 3 other nonprofits around how do we think about, race in the workplace, not DEI, but racial equity. What does that look like in a substantial way? Not making a donation to the NAACP and putting out a press release, but actually making changes in the way you operate. So there's a whole bunch of things where companies need help and are coming to us. And now we're actually building a toolkit. I don't know if there's any venture investors in the room, but we're building a toolkit with, we're looking for partners on that we can give to small companies, to any company at all, to say, if you want to benchmark yourself against what the top 1,000 companies, the largest 1,000 companies are doing, here's a toolkit for you to do that. And you can click and see, what does best practice look like? How do I do that? Be part of convenings where you're with other business leaders discussing the complexities of those issues. So that, I think, is something that we think might help create more of a bottom-up business movement.
Doing
as well.
Consulting to these companies, or how are you delivering all this stuff?
We see it as just a toolkit right now. We're 60 people. We can't consult.
And then they're on their own in terms of...
It's like, well, we partner with NASDAQ. That's between us and whoever watches this video, I guess, to do that. NASDAQ has been a very good partner of ours on reaching through to the private markets through a governance lens. And so we're working with them on this toolkit stroke convening idea. We have great relationships with some big consulting firms around the consulting model, but if I'm being really honest with you, we're in the middle of that right now.
It's really tricky, right?
It is really,
like ISS and those
exactly.
guys who, will rate you, and then you can buy a consulting project to improve your rating. Like, a lot of people have trouble with that.
Yeah. And I totally get it. And our board has been very clear on, you need to separate the rankings process and the ranking from anything you do with companies.
I was extorted by ISS.
We all have been.
Yeah, everybody hates ISS.
It's a bad model. It's a
terrible
You
model.
shouldn't be doing that. Period.
Yeah.
How do you think about comparing across industries? So if you think of like a Nike, for example, and a really robust supply chain versus Accenture, that's more, they could both be doing equally in terms of how they treat their employees and benefits and all those stakeholders. But then Nike's also dealing with all these other, like all the rest of the supply chain. How do you compare across industries, or is that?
Yeah. So thank you. We really struggle with that.
Yeah.
The fact is that it's very hard to compare JP Morgan with Exxon on climate, and my background's in climate, so I know how hard that is. You look through your lending portfolio and you could say, but Exxon has obviously, in terms of scope 1, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3, much more heavier footprint. So it's a struggle. We went to the public to ask them that question, and they said, actually, we would like you to just compare apples with apples. So you can break down the rankings that we produce and all the trackers and the measurements that we produce by industry and compare, and that's how a lot of companies do it. But if you just wanted to know who's best on fair pay, Walmart or Microsoft, you could do that too.
I have a question over here. Sorry, wait too far away.
Sorry.
Hi
there.
Hi. Can you share a little bit of kind of what you've noticed being either the secret sauce or kind of the necessary, I don't know, the word isn't necessarily like stakeholder organization within the company, but like for a lot of these companies, there will be some friction or some kind of uphill battling to get to the next stage. And what have you found to be necessary, whether it's like the founder bought in, the right employees working at the company to execute or drive things operationally forward, like the community of the companies, what needs to happen to allow these companies to kind of enter the space?
Number one, thank you. This has been a big part of our journey, is trying to figure that out, because it helps us identify what interventions we can make that will be most effective to drive change. Obviously, leadership, and the CEO is crucial. Wherever you don't have leadership bought in personally, it's going to be less effective. Interestingly, the Edelman Trust Barometer, if you're familiar with that work, has identified for the first time my company is the most trusted organization. So my company becomes the entity that I go to for information on things that are happening in my world. And even that, my CEO was identified as way more trustworthy than CEOs in general and companies in general. So it becomes personalized. So I think we're starting to see, and then if you extend that, communities of change can be catalyzed by companies as well. If I trust that the information I'm getting from my company is real on climate or on something else, and my company is now taking action on that, now that can help spark broader movement beyond that, as opposed to the information I'm getting from the media or from government. The other thing that, some of the other elements of that are having a framework. Where we see companies struggle is where they're trying to silo things. So, the people down there at the end of the corridor handle, human capital. We don't have to worry about that. That's HR. We don't really have to worry about sustainability. That's Bob's group over there. Where it's siloed, you tend to get a tremendous amount of friction, and then it goes back to gentleman's question here about conflicts between stakeholders. And so you tend to get competing forces inside of companies, which ultimately tends to be less effective. But the top companies tend to have an overarching framework, a leader that's totally bought in, and they operate on the basis of data. If you look at Intel, now I know they're a bunch of engineers, so they love data, but their reporting on how they're investing in human capital, for example, or on climate, reads like they're 10K. Like it is data driven, and there's not many pictures, or it's not a lot of sort of subjective opinion in there. It tends to be very anyway. So that's the persona of a company that tends to lead across the stakeholder model.
Grab some oatmeal. I'm going to throw one thing in. If you want to eat,
please.
I'm curious how you're processing or approaching this politicization of ESG.
Yeah. So I've been on stage and on TV with Vivek Ramaswamy. If you know Vivek, who's like the leader of that movement. So I have a lot of opinion on that, but I feel like politicians will do what politicians do, right? So and Mike Pence, has been a proponent of the criticism as well. It's actually, as an aside, it's interesting how little criticism it took to derail the whole ESG movement, which has been going for 20, 30 years. So there were obvious vulnerabilities there in the first place, which we can talk about. And ESG is now any sort of 3-letter acronym is sort of easy to weaponize, and people don't even know what it is anymore. So I grew up in that. I see it as a very clear investment framework for trying to understand risks relating to environmental, social, governance factors that made for smarter investment decision making. Not a political thing at all. How do we think about climate as an investment risk and opportunity? So that's how I see ESG. But now, unfortunately, it's become this lightning rod issue. We point to really two things. One is this is not about politics, it's about business. So what is the investment case, the business case for looking at a whole new set of risk areas where we can just make smarter decisions, get better data, figure out how should we be thinking about these issues through a business lens. And that's why most business leaders, in one way, shape, or form, are already doing that. The Business Roundtable's restatement of the purpose of a corporation in 2019 reflected that. So that's one pushback. It's not about politics. This is not about unelected business leaders advancing a progressive agenda. This is about business leaders trying to be better business leaders. Two is, and there's a strong investment case for that. Two is, when you poll the public, Republicans and Democrats agree that companies should be investing in good jobs, strong communities, healthy workforce. So the public opinion research would not support actually this sort of divisive rhetoric. And honestly, I don't think it's a winning ticket. I think it's just my opinion, but I don't think most people understand what the hell they're talking about.
Well, I don't either, but it feels very deja vu of what they did with critical race therapy. They didn't understand that either, but it became an actual thing. I think the same thing is going on with transgender issues. Something takes on a life with people who don't understand it. I'm just curious if it ends up working or not.
I mean,
which I'm sure you know the answer to.
This is why I try to get people to hook into our newsletter and start following what we're doing. Because change has always been with us, right? That's Heraclitus, ancient Greek. You never step twice in the same stream because it's already changed. The issue's not change. The issue is the speed of change, and it's freaking people out. And one of the things it's doing, and Martin just alluded to it, people are looking, actually sort of almost demanding, value-centric leadership. But each person has a different sense of what the value is. So part of what we have to do is we have to help companies navigate through these very challenging political times where they don't have to find themselves picking a label of red or blue. They're really just sticking with what are the values that my employees want, what my values my share owners want, what works in the marketplace. And the employees are increasingly coming at corporate leadership with they want the value to be X or they want the value. And the Christian nationalists want it to be one thing and the ACLU would want it to be something else. Well, part of what our job is to help businesses find out what's the best practices that helps you navigate through that question, which will dynamically change over time, even more so.
I do think what's happening is companies are not speaking up anywhere near as much as they used to. We've seen that, so that's one effect. And I don't think business leaders are coordinating a response to that as effectively as they might. That's also something we're working on now. I don't know what can catalyze that. Like, let's go back to my business leadership question. Is that something Jamie could do? Is that something that, I don't know, Satya Nadella could lead? It feels like it can't just be one. Right now it's every company for themselves. And I feel like if there was business leadership to espouse a vision for American values-led capitalism for the next generation, cut through the politics, go right to Main Street and say, actually, this is what we believe. It's good for business. It's good for Main Street. It puts America on the front foot in the world. And I feel like that, to me, it's got to come next. And I don't know where that comes from. I'm partly here at this event because I want to figure out who might do that.
I feel like that worked for Disney last round, saying this is what matters to our employees and customers. This round.
But go ahead.
No, I don't want to. I was just.
Yeah.
I have another question. I'm so far away, but I don't want to interrupt because I know. I totally agree with if there's not some obvious, generally financial benefit to doing it, company, it's going to be very hard for companies to engage. Can you go back to the PayPal example and just talk through a little bit of how you actually measured the benefit of this new program that you put in place and how you can see from before versus after that this was actually a financial benefit to the company?
So I'm actually part of PayPal's internal. So it's an internal thing, but they have an external advisory group, and so I see the work up close. They are in direct contact with their employees, who've sort of, to monitor, can they withstand a medical bill now, whereas they couldn't before? Like, what's their individual financial situations? So they're getting direct feedback from the employees themselves first and foremost, which is the most valuable source of.
Can quantitatively measure that?
Well, then you roll the numbers up to, okay, what is our turnover now versus then? What's our level of employee engagement? Various measures of employee productivity as well. And you can put numbers to all of those things. So what's the return on investment in that program? And the numbers have been, incredibly positive. So so it's done at multiple levels, but it's a huge investment. And I think, to the point we were trying to make earlier, this is not like a quick win, right? They started this. This is a pre-COVID thing, well pre-COVID, and it sort of, and even now, Dan, this documentary Ronaldo was talking about, why is Mona Lisa smiling? He talks about it great length in that documentary. I can send a link around after if anyone's interested in that.
So what's your advice to leaders then around the political angle? Is it to, there's some people who have come out, Brian Armstrong at Coinbase came out and publicly said, leave politics at home, we're here for work. Other people have been drawn one way or another. I mean, is it push it back at the door and just don't let that political agenda come into a company, or?
We haven't said that. No, I haven't seen that, quite honestly, being replicated in many big companies. As in, let's not talk about. Because what's a political issue? Is climate a political issue? Is
being gay?
Is right? Is that a political issue? Is race a political issue in the workplace? Kind of tough to separate.
But how do you stop it becoming a corporate issue? Whether you make the decision to put in gender neutral bathrooms across the corporate campus. Half the company thinks this is an enormous waste of money. What are we doing? And the other half is fantastic. Finally, we are going to recognize. I mean, where do you go on that? I mean,
so the single best piece of advice we give CEOs is you have to engage with your workforce in particular. You have to really understand motivations. You have to create conversations in the workplace so that people don't feel as though they have to check their values at the door. That's not easy, and that requires a lot of investment and a lot of investment in leadership as well. So rather than not talk about it, we've tended to see companies actually do it very privately. Don't talk about it publicly. The other element of that is the higher up you go, the more you talk about the business case. Brian Moynihan was on Squawk Box and was asked very pointedly, why are you doing all this woke BS? We noticed that you have this policy on gender, how do you react to that? He said, we're not. I was on reproductive rights as well. He said, we're just taking care of our employees.
That's right.
We're engaging with our employees. We want to know what they feel, how they think about these issues. There's a very strong business case for investing in our people, and that's what any good business leader would do. It's no different from that. So,
and there is no one-size-fits-all answer. So in your organization, that's why we like to keep throwing out examples of best practices. Yep. So you pick the ones that fit your organization the best, not some hypothetical organization. And we trust business people to come up with really good solutions, because one of the things business is good at, better than politics or academia, is finding solutions to complex problems. Well, a complex problem is, do you stand up for your employees or not? I mean, I don't think Iger went looking for a fight with DeSantis. DeSantis, I think, went looking for a fight with Iger, which was a stupid fight to pick. My money's on Iger on that one. But the point is that he didn't get there overnight. It started with, no, we're not going to go along with discriminating against gay employees. And DeSantis wouldn't let that go. So then the no gay ban went up, and it escalated to where it is today, where DeSantis has painted himself in the corner of being anti-business. In the state, theoretically, it's pro-business.
Yeah, I don't pretend. Listen, none of this is easy.
Yeah, no.
There is no single answer, and I think this is why it needs an investment from leadership in how we think about our different stakeholders and how we navigate these sort of seemingly endless politicization of everything until that business climate changes. And this is why I go back to okay, how do you get business on the front foot on these issues? How do you say, this is not about politics, actually, this is about good business, this is what it looks like, and this is the investment now we have to make as a company going forward. And what's good for Under Armour might be, you know, might not be good for, I don't know, Ben & Jerry's, you know, given their customer base. You know, I don't know if you're following the Bud Light situation, right? Great example. Like, did they know who their customers were? Or did they know who their customers were and like, okay, we don't care. We're going to do this. Ben & Jerry's unashamedly progressive, right? But if you buy their ice cream, maybe you don't care about that, or maybe you do because you want to support them. But at least you know.
Again, that's why it's so important. We have to, I think, give business leadership the tools to do this constant navigation. And it's not like you get to one point, oh, okay, we got that solved. It's just going to keep accelerating.
It's a business strategy issue, right. And you treat it like any other business strategy
How
issue.
would you advise on the media companies who clearly know, if you're CNN or Fox, you clearly know your customer base, but you're leading that customer base. You know, I think there's probably an argument to say that the political challenges we have are actually media challenges. Politicians are great followers.
Yeah.
They're not really leaders. They're phenomenal followers of market sentiment or public sentiment. And the leaders are actually becoming the media companies. Are any media companies in your top 100?
Or bottom 10%?
Or
Yeah, no, they are. That's a great question. I'm trying to think who our top media company was. It wasn't Comcast.
Vox?
It wasn't Fox.
No, Vox.
Vox.
Oh, Vox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Media companies themselves, if you think about, do they have a duty to try and give their customers what their customers want and will pay for? Or are they trying to shape the narrative for the betterment of the country? I don't pretend to know the answer to that. I know.
Have you polled that question?
Yeah, in business in general, most people want companies to lead on societal issues. They want companies to make capitalism work better for them. That's a universal belief, I think, which gives me a lot of hope for what Just Capital does. There was a period in time where we were worried that people were kind of losing faith in the American dream, and I don't see that. I don't see that. I think more people feel like they want it to work better for them in their communities. They want access to it. But I don't see people turning against business.
I have a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, and I love what you guys are doing, but it's just enough. You know, when I look at working with BMW, for example, they have their employee surveys, and it turns out everybody's happy, 85% or so. And then I talk to, we have 1,000 people that we've worked with, and most of them want to leave tomorrow if they just have a chance to do so.
Yeah.
Same with Accenture, same with Avant, those kind of companies. Most employees would want to leave the door if they just knew a better way somehow. Same with sustainability, is getting a little better or being the best of the roster enough in our times. So my question is there a way to crank up the fire and really look at metrics that people might not even be aware of, because we think that the workplace has to be a certain way and we can think out of the box.
Yeah.
And we fall beyond the box.
I have a lot of humility about what we do, right? I don't pretend that we have some magic box. That I feel as though we're urging companies to think about things a bit differently. And in some cases, happily, increasing number of cases, acting differently on issues. So, but what your question really goes to is it a relative scale or an absolute scale? Should we be setting absolute sort of scales of performance or expectations or goals for businesses in the world? to aspire to be
Which is
better.
what I think I started out asking. I was going to say, I think what you're asking is there an objective definition of just? And is it well beyond where any of these folks are? In which case...
And it might be moving because we don't even know.
Yes.
You know, many of the people that I ask, they say, okay, a workplace that I'm happy with looks like this. But when I ask them a little beyond that, I say, oh man, I really want something.
Yeah.
So we don't even know what we want and what's possible. And until we bring that to the table, we can't reach that destination.
We've been cautious about leading the witness.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, I always felt in our strategy, the foundation of it was creating a much stronger line between how the public expectations of business and then performance of business. And that line hadn't been drawn before, actually, not in a systematic, objective way. So I think we set out to draw that line, and I think we've done that very well. And now companies come to us to say, what does the public think about this? Or what does best practice look like? So that's very strong. But to your point, Peter, it could be that the next 10 years of Just tries to now use that in a way that, you know,
that's not just
that we are.
Let's not be reactive, let's be proactive.
Yeah. But it's the limits of market research, though, right? It's the classic limits of market research question, though. It's the reason that the Bell telephone companies didn't invent the cell phone, right? Because they surveyed everybody and nobody ever told them they wanted a cell phone. We're all very happy with our phone that had the long cord, right? That was all we needed. Because there's a limit to what people can tell you about what they're going to want 10 or 20 years from now. You typically can't get it in market research.
That's that famous Steve Jobs quote. They asked him, did you do a focus group when you designed the iPhone? He said, how could I? How could they describe something they've never seen?
Exactly.
But in our...
They don't know what they want. I have to show them what they want.
I think yes, absolutely. But when in our focus groups, what people are talking about is, you know, what affects 100 million Americans. I want to be able to educate my kids. I want to be able to, you know, put a roof over our head. I want to be able to build prosperity and wealth for the future. And I want to work really hard and have dignity at work in order to do that. I don't think that is going to shift. I think how that is done by companies is what's shifting. And we're not telling them, you got to do this, and that's just and that's not just. I think that bar keeps getting raised. But right now it's going in the opposite direction for many people. So I sort of feel like we're not trying to give them the product and the answer based on their polling. We're trying to surface the issues that really matter if capitalism is really going to have, you know, a great generational impact. And so I feel it gives us plenty of room to create the next iPhone.
Are there any issues that you surface that really matter, but you can't quite make the connection to it's good for the bottom line or it's good for business?
Yeah. Third most important issue last year, I think, was integrity. We want our business leaders in America to have integrity. So I don't know if you know this, but I went to like a dozen board members and said, because they're all on big boards of, you know, boards of big companies. What does leading with integrity mean to you? How do you measure that? Everyone's like, yeah, of course we do that. Well, how do you know? I got 10 different answers. So that was something that we were like, okay, well, what's a proxy for that? So we started to look at were there big controversies around major issues? Were there moments when the company had a collapse of leadership integrity? Like, could we have predicted Boeing's cultural erosion, lack of governance? You know, what do you think about Facebook? Is Facebook a force for good in the world? Or is it undermining our moral framework? I have a teenage daughter, or she's not a teenager anymore, but how do I think about Instagram's preying on teenage girls and body image? You know, how do you measure that? That's the stuff we grapple with. Data, truth. How do we think about the data we're getting? How do we know what's true? And by the way, what is true? So some of those questions are the things that we have a really tough time. The stuff that you can measure, oftentimes, the easiest doesn't get to the heart of what's really happening.
Isn't truth kind of gone out the window in the sense of, and both sides of the aisle do this, but Fox clearly got pulled up on the Tucker Carlson and others spouting stuff that they genuinely knew were lies. Now CNN does it as well. I think if there's an inquiry into CNN, it would be exactly the same. But truth, and Trump has done incredibly well by just saying, if you just keep saying it on enough, you will get there. And so does the other side. I'm not picking just on Trump, but truth seems to, you can now lie your way out of anything, and society just accepts it and says, well, everyone's doing it, who gives,
Yeah.
I think that's.
And by the way, that with AI, in the next few years, that is going to become the defining issue.
Yeah, what I was just about to say, so we just launched a thing at our last executive meeting on Monday. We've decided to staff up in generative AI because it's that one topic now that's emerging so fast. And so I think we can say this. So we sent a letter to the heads of the 6 top companies that we felt could impact the conversation. Obviously Microsoft, obviously GPT, obviously, and Amazon, it's Google, it's Facebook, or whatever it's called now, because I know Meta's out the window, or is on the way out the window. I'm not sure what it's going to be called when they're done with Meta being buried. But my point is that starting to look at this issue of generative AI. So AI has been around for a long time, 30, 40 years. But generative AI is a big enough threat to every system in business that business is now saying, what is it that we need to know? What is it we need to do? How do we get on top of this? It's moving faster than any of us realized. So we have now launched it, and I don't know how much you want to put meat on that bone, but we've launched this inquiry, which I think is going to be part of our basic research capability going forward, is how do we navigate this? So that's constantly our issue. How do we navigate change? And how do we do it in a way that actually is data-driven and provides opportunities for better company performance through best practices? And that's really our whole, and even though we have .com in our name for reasons that are hilarious, but I won't go there. Sullivan and Cromwell did that to us. But we're a nonprofit. To your point about ISS, because I have been extorted by them, same way you were probably. We don't ever want to be a for-profit company, let alone a public for-profit company, which is where ISS went. So we will stay a nonprofit. That way we don't have a horse in the race directly. It's the quality of our research and our companies listening and gaining value from us. If they are, we prosper. If we fall off of that, that'll be the self-correcting mechanism. But so far, we've really done a good job, and he's done a good job, I'm just a bystander. But the company's done a really good job of picking up on these trends and providing solid information. We had a corporate engagement scorecard that we used to keep track of, like how many companies each year were. What's it up to now from last year?
We're at about 675.
Can you imagine 675? They seek us out now out of the 1,000. 675. First year we did it was like 20.
Yeah.
To see what in our portal they can tap. Not only what is, because we not only take the data from the company itself, we take it from all these extraneous sources, and then we regurgitate and mix it. So the companies are now coming into the portal saying, what can I learn about what my company's doing through this lens that would provide better performance? And then you have people like Larry Fink, who 2 years ago declared the old method of evaluating companies. The head of Carlyle Europe is the Belgian guy who is basically gone 100% green. It's an amazingly interesting time to be looking at green investments versus traditional ones, particularly when you're Carlyle Europe. So these things are happening with such rapidity. That's why we need to exist. If things slow down and everybody can figure out what to do tomorrow, they won't need us at that point.
I think what we can do on AI, thinking about that, it sort of reminds me a bit of climate, because people would say, I don't really care about climate change, but I'm really worried about jobs. Well, if you know anything about climate, obviously those two things are completely connected. So I see AI a bit like that, insofar as you can say, I'm really cared about, I'm, you know, member of the public, these are the things that matter to me. AI is going to affect those things, and it's our job to figure out how. And we can connect the dots. And it goes back to your question, Peter, about sort of, okay, at what point are we educating and informing as opposed to responding to what we're being told and tracking? How do you balance that?
And going to the leaders of the companies that are springing AI and asking them to help us develop some criteria. That's something we're uniquely capable to do because we're neutral. So,
but those 600 and odd companies are all grappling with that question.
Yeah.
And I think we can be a signal for them. I think they see us as, you know, a resource that can help them make better decisions. They can help them figure out what others are doing. We do a ton of convenings now, so business leaders coming together to talk about stuff like that. So that in itself, I think, has been very helpful. And I don't see that many other business organizations doing that. Business Council, Business Roundtable, Conference Board. Conference Board's doing some great work. All the consulting firms, BCG, actually head of strategy just joined our board. Maybe that will help us get a handle on more of a consulting approach. We have great relationships with EY. Mark Weinberg, who ran EY, is on our board as well. So we've got a good connection to like...
Committee.
Pardon me?
In our audit committee.
Right. So I feel like we've got a good framework for really jumping into business leadership to help them navigate this. But I don't know what the answer is yet, Duncan.
I may have missed this earlier, but did you say that you can like look at the correlation between your system and performance? So against like
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
And you
on
can
the website?
and you can break that down by different types of financial performance and different elements of stakeholder leadership as well.
Is it when you're trying to figure out what matters most across different factors? So do I care more about AI impact on jobs or climate impact on jobs or whatever as a member of the public? Is it a conjoint? Like how are you forcing people to make trade-offs?
It's a max diff, exactly. Yes. So if you were to take the survey, company A, company B, company A, you know, is good on this, bad on this, good on this, and then
you have to pick
which is more just.
Right, and then based on that choice, it feeds you the next.
Precisely.
Choice. Yeah, that's what.
Explain max diff.
Yeah. So it's just a technique that's been used in consumer marketing for ages, which requires you to prioritize one thing over another in a world where you can't have everything. And if you do that tens of thousands of times, the model will tell you on a relative basis the importance of all those issues. That's how it works.
Yep.
And you can also break it down by respondent. So if you said, I only want to know what Republicans think, you get their breakdown. I only know what, I don't know, African Americans think. You can do that. So there's tons of ways you can, which is kind of interesting, and we've obviously done that. And that's why we don't actually see a lot of difference between people on a lot of core issues. You know, so which is why I don't think it's a winning ticket. You know, the divisive thing. I think it can affect things at the margin, but most people in the center left, center right now are probably wondering who to vote for because it's kind of Hobson's choice.
Do you measure the presence or absence of organized labor, and if so, what are you looking for? How do you factor that in?
We measure the issues that organized labor responds to. Unionization is not something that is good or bad in our model. We don't measure that. We don't have an opinion on that. What we do is focus on the underlying issues. If a company is doing things that, so we've done a lot of, this is an example of something we polled on specifically because efforts to unionize are happening everywhere, right? What do people think? Opinions very divided. When you ask people, should workers be treated well, you know, have a safe work environment, fair pay, you know, how do you know that's happening? You get a lot of agreement. But the mechanism by which those sort of issues should be pursued, a lot of disagreement. So that's why we don't it's not a good or a bad to unionize.
But we do look at the Jeff. We look at the precursor. We look at the precursor of unionization. So the precursor at Amazon was they had to clean up their act when starting wages. Right. Same with Walmart. Mm-hmm. And when they understood that, they were able to stop getting unionized. Now, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that they basically turned around and started getting unionized as much more, I can't say. But I can tell you that the reason they did is they realized that the precursor to unionization was they weren't paying their workers enough. And so once they turned that corner, they started winning. I think it's going to be interesting to see how Starbucks plays out, candidly, for a whole bunch of reasons. But I just want to throw that out. You had your question. You keep going. You had another part of that.
I was just wondering if you show or you measure any correlation between the presence or absence of organized labor and any of the other worker well-being metrics that you're looking for.
We've not done that. We've done the underlying issues correlated to performance. As I said earlier, and like companies that lead on even things like pay equities. I had a big back and forth with Vivek on pay equity. You know, in front of like 3,000 people at the Javits Center, he's like, Martin, why is Disney doing a racial equity audit on pay? He's got no business doing that. And, you know, he's like setting it up as a political thing, as like a scary thing. Like it sounds really scary. And I said, well, if you're running a company, would you want to know that you're paying people the same regardless of their skin color? Or do you just hope that you're doing that? You just hope that you're, you know, a fair employer. And if you do care about, so which is it? You know, and if you're serious about treating people the same, which you say you are, what data do you gather to know that throughout your organization? That's an example of how you took a political issue, just make it about business, you know. So anyway, so it's the underlying issues that really, I think, drive it.
One question about performance. Are you looking at performance by efficiency internally? You know, cost savings for not having to hire again and train again, more hours spent in the office because healthcare is secure, or are you looking at sales and what's driving sales?
It's mostly accounting and market performance data. It's hard to get. You can get anecdotal information like that from individual companies if they'll give it to you or if they publish it. But it's very hard to compare in any large numbers because the methodologies for gathering that data don't always allow for that comparison to be fair. So it's a bit of a tricky thing, but we try to look at, obviously, across, like I say, accounting, market performance, you know, traditional financial metrics, you know, valuation, stuff like that, risk, you know, PE ratio, all that's fairly straightforward. But the underlying things tend to be individual, idiosyncratic to companies.
So you can't say, you know, this CEO took a big stance on a political issue and sales went up like this, or sales went down like this, or they started talking about their sustainability.
It's a great, listen, partly we have a capacity problem because we only have like a 4-person investment team. But I take your point. I think more data like that actually would, and we try to encourage companies to make the business case all the time because, you know, when they go on CNBC and so someone says, well, you know, I see you're investing in this or doing that, isn't that a cost? You know, you're investing in your workforce. We think about workers as a cost. They can talk about the payback.
There's a follow-on effect too. Like I think it's the head of Yoplait was asked last week. You know, are you doing all these, you know, basically socially relevant things because you think your sales will go up? Is that what you're doing? And he goes, I don't know if they're going to go up or not. It's just the right thing to do. I'll bet you that statement is actually going to do more good than the decision they made to do in the first place. In other words, that they are acknowledging. We don't know for sure what the data would say. We wish we had it. In the absence of data, we'll do what we think the right thing is, and we hope it has a positive effect. When people hear that, they tend to resonate to it. They then trust more. That's why I think it's true that business is becoming more trusted, as it should, than politics, because we are a lot more objective.
A lot of this, honestly, people intuitively get. Like, if you're a good business leader, I think most people just understand. You don't just focus on profits tomorrow. You're trying to invest across all these areas. Anyone who's run a business knows that. I think we're just trying to create some framework about it and shift the narrative on what that actually means.
But it does sound like what you said earlier is bubbling up through mention of integrity. I mean, it sounds like that's the moment in which people go, okay, see something in there that feels like that.
All right. I think
Thank
that's,
you.
yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ronaldo.
Thanks, Martin.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.